Hi, I'm Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of this fourth series of video programs on postgraduate supervision. As in the three previous series, the videos are not professionally staged productions, but they have been produced from simple recordings of a residential staff development program held at the Ballina Beach Resort in northern New South Wales in 1996. This year's program focuses on postgraduate supervision of NESB students, short for non-English speaking background students. I hope you will find the following video useful.
We dealt this morning with problems that were experienced, and when I looked back at it, I saw a variety of issues that had been raised. I mean, we heard about the appropriateness of current models of postgraduate supervision, and what appeared to be a potential and in some cases an actual gap between the rhetoric and the experience of postgraduate study and supervision. We also heard about a variety of issues relating to isolation, particularly in the initial stages of study by postgraduate students, issues relating to the appropriateness of certain kinds of assessment processes, and the need wherever possible to try and ensure a match of expectations between supervisors and students. One of the key points that came through certainly for me was the danger of oversimplification and the danger of generalising, so that we saw, for example, that issues such as language issues, social issues, and indeed gender issues had the capacity to make a very much more complex picture in the process of postgraduate supervision than just simple cultural differences. And indeed we were dealing with individual circumstances in many cases that also needed to be taken into account. It has been said on a number of occasions that, you know, postgraduate study actually represents a contractual obligation on a number of sides. And the parties to the contract are the student, the supervisor and the institution. And it seems to me that clarifying some of the contractual responsibilities and expectations for different kinds of student and indeed many different kinds of supervisors is part of what we're doing here. Our speaker is Gerald Brameld. Gerald has, with the School of Civil Engineering at the Queensland University of Technology, and has been the director of the Physical Infrastructure Centre there since 1980, a centre that is responsible for all postgraduate research training. He has a particular interest in the professional development of graduate students, especially in written and verbal communication. Please welcome Gerald Brameld.
Thanks very much. I guess I had two roles here today when I first spoke to Autrin. Firstly was to talk about a few things that I found interesting, and secondly to address some of the questions which arose from the session this morning. And so I intend to do that. In relation to, I guess, the terminology that I like to use is generic skills with postgraduate students. The written part of it, I think, is very capably being discussed by our previous speaker. And I'd like to speak a little bit on the oral presentations. And when we think about generic skills for postgraduate students, we need to think about what are these sorts of areas that they're going to be working in when they graduate. And obviously the first one that comes to mind is the presentation of seminars, the conduct of seminars, workshops and so on. And these, of course, raise a number of issues that students, and not just NESB students, but I think all students have problems with, such as public speaking, framing and asking questions, chairing a session, leading a discussion, providing a vote of thanks. So all of these are skills that we have gone to great lengths to try to develop within our students in addition to the normal technical skills that we expect of postgraduate students. The way in which we've gone about that is to introduce a postgraduate seminar series where the students take on all the roles as the session chairs, giving the votes of thanks, leading the discussion, It's compulsory for every student to ask 1 or 2 questions within every 2 or 3 seminars, so that they can't escape and hide at the back. They have to ask questions. And although we have a fairly diverse group, and the sorts of things that we go from hard structural engineering through to things like wastewater treatment and so on, we expect the students to be able to at least converse and ask questions across the disciplines and beyond those areas in which they're working. Now, this does take a little bit of encouragement, but certainly it seems to work. In relation to how we go then, I guess I've been involved with the rostrum movement for quite some period of time, and so as a result I've introduced a sort of rostrum approach to running the seminars, where at the end of the seminar there's a brief critique given to the student. Again, not a destructive critique, but certainly a very constructive critique, using the rostrum model that every bad comment must be sandwiched between 2 good comments. And so therefore the students are being at least built up for more than 50% of the time during the critique. So I think that these are some of the things that we've been doing in relation to this generic skills and public speaking. And I guess the comment that Eureka made earlier, that she had great difficulty asking the questions when you're in a big format. When you've got a smaller group, which are your peers and the staff from the department, it certainly is easier at that stage to come to grips with those concepts. That's what I'd like to say in relation to the generic skills. In relation to some of the questions that were raised this morning, I think that I'd like to offer some suggestions, and I certainly don't propose that they're the absolute solutions to any of these things. I was horrified to hear this morning that some supervisors are still insisting that their names should go first on the publications. I thought that was well and truly outdated now, and it's the attitude that we have taken is if the student writes the paper, the student's name goes first. The first speaker, Tanya, had a sample of 6 people that she'd surveyed, and I guess I've got a much smaller sample because just last Friday I received an email from one of our female NESB PhD graduates. She just received a letter to say that her doctorate had been awarded, and it was a most complimentary letter, and she'd gone through all the various staff members that had assisted her on the way through. And she'd had a rough trot because her first supervisor retired while she was in the process of doing a PhD. Her the successor was stolen. So she had 3 supervisors over that period of time, and 2 males and a female, and that was probably a little bit difficult for her. Her final supervisor, she was actually from Sri Lanka. Her last supervisor was from Jordan. So there were some quite different cultures there, of course, involved in that process. And she was very complimentary of the whole supervisory process and sent letters of comments of thanks to everybody. But in particular, and the one which I guess hit me the hardest, was that she put a paragraph about me as the centre director. And she particularly referred to the fact that I was her father away from home. And I think that one of the important things that we need to do to address some of the problems that we have with students is that there has to be one person, or at least one person in a department or a centre or whatever, who can take on this role of the father image, the person that they can come to with problems. And she had some problems with her mother and the person that she was supposed to be marrying, and she came to, I mean, I couldn't solve the problem, but at least I was there as a shoulder that she could spill the problems to, and we talked through all of the various issues. So my sample is a little bit smaller than 6, but I guess I've got 100% success rate. Isolation was a problem which that Christine raised. And that's a real problem, isn't it? Particularly with the overseas students. They come and they live here, and they don't get to see each other very frequently, except during the lecture time or the undergraduates, the postgraduates, if they're in the same room. And we've found that in our library it tends to now become a meeting point for the postgraduate students, because all of the coffee shops and all of those things close down at 6:30 or 7 o'clock, and late in the evening they want to do something, and they all get round together in the library, and there's areas there where they play cards and other games of chance till later on in the evening. And I think that perhaps we've been talking to this with our liaison librarian, that we do need to have some sort of facility within the university structure to provide that social interaction on a group basis for these students, just where they can have a cup of coffee and talk to get away from the study and away from the research. The last comment that I'll make is in relation to some comments that were made earlier about students feeling lonely and having problems with supervisors and so on. And perhaps I can throw in a plug, if you like, for the model that my university has adopted, and that is that PhD students can only be accepted into an accepted university research centre or a centre of research concentration. And of course the big advantage of that sort of a model is that you've got a group of people that they can talk to. You do have a person like a centre director who can be a father figure for some of the younger students and some of the younger supervisors too. I often have the young staff coming in who are supervising also coming in to talk about problems that they may wish to discuss. So I think that that model where you tend to bring the researchers together rather than having them sitting in an individual office by themselves doing their own thing certainly has some merit to it. And finally, I guess the thing that I would like to stress most as a supervisor, and I've supervised quite a few students, particularly from overseas, is that we have to be flexible. We can't have a rigid model. Every student is different. Every student's an individual, and it doesn't matter whether they're females, males, NESB students, or Australian students. We have to look at them as an individual. And I think if we can keep that always in the back of our mind, a number of the problems that we seem to be faced with could very well disappear immediately.
Our next speaker is Nick Knight. Nick is in the Faculty of Asian and International Studies at Griffith University, where he has been both head of the School of Modern Asian Studies and Deputy Dean for Teaching and Learning. He teaches political science, problems and methods in research, and politics and ideology in China, and has had considerable experience with the supervision of postgraduate students from NES background at both Masters and PhD level. Would you please welcome Nick Knight?
I'm going to discuss this issue of negotiating expectations between supervisor and NESB research student in the social sciences and humanities. Now, I've specified the social sciences and humanities because that's the area that I work in, and I thought that I might be being a bit bold if I extended my comments to the natural sciences as well, because there may be some very real differences that I'm not aware of. But I think that some of the points that I'll make may be relevant there as well. I'm going to look at the issues of different cultural understandings of the role of the supervisor, the extent of the supervisor's responsibility for revising drafts of the thesis, and the extent of personal support of the supervisor for the student. Research is a complex and demanding activity, usually pursued in isolation, and for the beginning researcher, often under relatively difficult material constraints. The graduate research student must confront the difficult task of defining the research problem, justifying why this research problem has significance, and formulating an argument. For many students, these essential dimensions of research are uncharted territory, and many feel insecure and inadequate to find their way through it. Consequently, the feelings of isolation experienced by many research students can be accompanied by a declining confidence in their ability to successfully negotiate the different and difficult phases of the research process. The technical demands of mastering a large and complex field of study and the requirement to formulate an academically viable personal response to the research problem, challenging enough on their own, are thus frequently accompanied by the negative psychological effects of research. Research thus looms for many Australian research students as both a technically and psychologically demanding process. For NESB research students who have come from another land to pursue postgraduate students at an Australian university, these pressures are compounded. Not only must they function at a very high level of competence, often in an abstract and specialised realm of study, in a language which is not their first language, they must reorient themselves to requirements, criteria and expectations different from those prevailing in the university systems of their own countries. The problems faced by all postgraduate research students makes the relationship between student and supervisor especially important, for it is a relationship which can contribute substantially to the capacity of the student to make good progress with and eventually complete the research. But the relationship between supervisor and student is not one which can easily be defined, and it is likely to vary according to the personalities of both parties and to the dynamics established as a result of the need for them to work closely and productively on a long-term basis on a complex process. The expectations of supervisor and student may very well diverge without either party being aware, at least in the early stages of the student's research, that this is the case. It is important, I argue, that these expectations be aired very early in the student's candidature, and where it is clear expectations diverge, it is absolutely necessary for these to be the subject of negotiation. Both supervisor and student must be aware of the functions which each will perform in their mutual relationship. Each should know what his or her functions and duties will be. Each should know the limits placed on their relationship. If expectations are negotiated early in the student's candidature and renegotiated occasionally as the candidature proceeds, there is much less likelihood of strains appearing in the relationship as a result of disappointments and frustrations occurring due to misapprehensions about the appropriate and accepted role and duties that each party must perform. Articulated and negotiated expectations are likely to lead to a harmonious and productive working relationship. If negotiating expectations of the supervisor-student relationship is important for postgraduate research students of Australian origin whose first language is English, it is doubly important for NESB students from other countries. Many overseas students, particularly those from Asian countries, and they're the ones with whom I've had most experience, they often have quite inappropriate expectations of the supervisor's role. Such students may come from university cultures in which the teacher is regarded as an unquestionable source of knowledge, and whose function as supervisor is to tell the student what to study and what to think. There is in such cultures much less stress on the importance of individuality and the related concept of originality. Consequently, the student is likely to regard his or her sphere of responsibility and intellectual autonomy much more narrowly than an Australian, English or American postgraduate would. The supervisor of the NESB student at an Australian university should be cognizant of the way in which the cultural and intellectual background of the student may shape his or her expectations of the supervisor. The supervisor needs to devote time to eliciting these expectations and responding to them by explaining the nature of postgraduate research at an Australian university and the very great significance which is placed on originality of thought. It needs to be made very clear that while the supervisor may make suggestions about how the student might argue his or her thesis, at the end of the day, the argument of the student's thesis is the student's own responsibility. It is not for the supervisor to tell the student what his or her argument should be, much less to insist on a particular argument. The student must recognise that he or she bears the responsibility for formulating and articulating an argument in response to the research problem, but can use the supervisor as a sounding board for testing the viability of this argument. Now, another important issue which needs to be negotiated between supervisor and NESB student is the responsibility for revising and correcting drafts of the thesis, and Sue's already touched on this issue. The student may well be under the misapprehension that the supervisor's role includes rendering stilted and faulty prose into fluent and readable English. Now, my own view is that the supervisor's role in responding to drafts of the thesis is much more limited than this, and extends only to some light copy editing and modelling of good writing techniques, of the sort of thing that Sue's already talked about. The more extensive revisions and corrections required by the drafts of NESB students is, I argue, the student's responsibility. But this is an issue which needs to be discussed and agreed by supervisor and student. Other rather more prosaic areas of the supervisor-student relationship will need to be negotiated, and include how often the two will meet and the importance of establishing and sticking to deadlines, and of course that's not singular to NESB students. Finally, the supervisor will need to think through the extent to which he or she is willing to commit him or herself to the personal and moral encouragement and support of the NESB student. The NESB student's need for this may be more extensive than is the case for the Australian postgraduate student, and if so, the supervisor will need to develop a strategy which encourages the capacity of the student to function independently and effectively as a researcher. This is an issue which requires some sensitivity on the part of the supervisor, but the limits to supervision in this area need to be negotiated between supervisor and student in a candid way in order to avoid misunderstandings and resentments arising. Now, the NESB student is very likely to come to the research process with an intellectual and cultural background which constructs certain expectations of the supervisor. To ensure that these are appropriate and to modify them if not, it is necessary to bring them out into the open and talk them through. If areas of potential misunderstanding are handled in this way and expectations agreed, then the relationship between supervisor and NESB postgraduate research student is likely to be more harmonious and productive than it otherwise might be. Now, the previous speaker had a sample of one which he referred to. Now, I've got an even smaller sample, if you can believe it. Some of you may have seen this article which appeared in the Australian. I don't know this student at all. She was a PhD student at the University of Sydney. And all I know about her is that what comes in the article itself, and obviously it's probably a bit small for you to read, but the nub of the problem, as far as this article presents it anyway, is that the student came from Pakistan with already having passed 2 MA degrees and enrolled in a PhD program with an AusAid scholarship. Now, as the article says, after 4.5 years, the university decided to terminate her scholarship and her candidature and to offer her as a consolation prize a master's degree rather than a PhD. Now, the complaints that were made about the student was that there was a lack of progress and that her English was too poor for the supervisor to even commence to revise. On the student side, she said she found patronising attitudes, she got poor and discontinuous supervision, and when she did have supervision, drafts were returned very, very late, sometimes taking months and months to return. Now, it seems to me that the issue that I'm addressing today, that is the negotiating expectations between supervisor and student, is only one part of the problem which seems to have emerged in the case of this student, obviously with very serious consequences for the student. It seems to me that there are some very difficult institutional issues which need to be thought about, and my own view is that the Australian universities have not really begun to think about these issues at an institutional level. There's the idea that we can take in students, NESB students from overseas, and treat them more or less by the same standard and criteria as students of Australian origin. Now, there's arguments for and against that sort of issue. I mean, there's obviously issues of standards that we have to maintain as well. But I think there are certain very basic issues. The issue of what level of English competence do we allow students from overseas, from NESB students, to enrol in PhD and research degrees. Now, my understanding at Griffith, I may be wrong here, Mary, but my understanding is that the level that they're allowed into undergraduate and postgraduate programs is the same. It's exactly the same. Now, my view is that that's probably an unrealistic expectation, and I personally have a PhD student from China who came in with a very, very basic TOEFL, is that what it's called, TOEFL level, could hardly speak English at all and enrolled in a PhD. I'm still supervising that student 7 years later, and his English has not improved very much. He's a very hard-working student and a good student, and he's having all of these problems which I've discussed in my short presentation today. And I'm very fearful that he's not going to get his PhD after many years of difficult and painstaking work, grappling with the ideas of originality and problems of English and so on. So my view is that at an institutional level, universities need to think about what level of competency in English should it's a basic issue, what level of competence do they need to have in order to satisfactorily function at postgraduate level.